about who you are. It's about who God has made you to be and who He's made you to become. So how do you know the difference between a cop-out and a valid reason, a loophole, a valid loophole, and a cop-out? Here, I wrote a verse on your note sheet. Look at it. Galatians 5:19 through 21. He says, the acts of the sinful nature are obvious. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery. Debauchery is a fancy word for pursuing your own, the satisfaction of your own desires, pleasures and things. Idolatry and witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies, and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. It's a loophole, it's a valid loophole if it's not a sin, first of all. It's a valid loophole, it's a valid reason to not change if the trait in question doesn't manifest itself in a sin. I've listed a couple other reasons here. Number 2, you can manage around the trait. Number 3, other people who are strong in it can offset your weakness. Or number 4, you're willing to draw personal boundaries for yourself. But see, there are some things that are just out and out sin. And those things never qualify as a that's just who I am. Those things never qualify as something where you can say, I do not need to change this. Because God has called you to be more like Him. Fits of rage, jealousy, anger, discord, times when you speak negative words against other people, those things are inappropriate and just simply cannot be manifestations of a behavior trait inside of you that is God-honoring and that is moving in the positive directions. So I will give you a get-out-of-change-free card only if you are saying it to stick with God's will for your life. I'll give you an illustration. My friend a friend that I have who used to live in Chicago, his name is Chuck, and he told me once, because I was watching him, and I noticed every single time he drove anywhere with his wife always drove the car, whether it was his car, her car, or whatever. She always drove. And I just asked him, I said, how'd this arrangement come to be? Because in my family, my dad always drove the car, and in my wife's family, her dad always drove the car. And so I was just curious. I asked him, and he said, in the city, she drives because I get mad. And I've realized that if I drive the car in the city, I get too mad for my own good. So here's a guy who recognized a weakness, and he created some limits around himself to manage that weakness. And then he was living in a humble attitude that says, I will never drive in the city. I will always have my wife drive. If you can manage around the situation, then it's okay for you to say, okay, this is who I am. This is who God made me to be. This is an area of weakness I have. I sometimes get too mad, and so I'm going to limit my arrangements until I get control of that kind of stuff. Okay, so enough with the loopholes. Enough with the excuses. Enough with your get out of change free. I want to give you some motivation here. The desire for change. Here's 2 things I want you to desire and long for. Number 1, if the trait in question is part of God's design for you, then I want to motivate you to change your attitude toward it. Hopefully I've done that a little bit already. To say, this is who God made me to be. I am going to maximize my strengths. I have abilities here. I don't have abilities there. I'm not going to worry about my lack of abilities over here. I'm going to maximize the things God has gifted me to do. And I want to invite all of you to identify what those things are and just flourish in them. Jump into them, embrace them, flourish in them, and say, God, how can I use this for your glory and your kingdom? But then number 2, if the things are not part of God's will for you, then joyfully embrace the change that God is going to bring about. Because if the trait in question is not God's will for you, He has something better in store for you, and we just need to embrace it, joyfully enter into it. So, all of that to try to help us get the groundwork laid so we can say, okay, I'm ready, I'm willing. But now push comes to shove, how do we do it? What are the tools for change? Well, the last few weeks we've been looking at the nation of Israel, and their exodus from Egypt and their attempt to change themselves from being slaves in Egypt to being free people honoring God. And so we've been looking at some of those aspects of change. And you know what? I thought about going back to Israel. I thought about going back to the exodus from Egypt stuff. And the problem is the Israelites never got this right. They always would change a little bit and then flip-flop back. They would change a little bit and then they'd flop back. They'd say, God, we love you. And then 5 days later, God, we don't care about you. We want to go back to Egypt. Then he'd send some plague on them, and then they'd kneel down, they'd pray. They'd say, oh, God, we're sorry. We love you. We're back in honoring you and stuff. And so then he would say, okay, let's get on with it. And so he'd bless them, and then they'd start moving a little bit. And then they'd say, oh, no, we don't. You know, it was over and over and over again. Like for 1,000 years, the people of Israel have continually done this. It's no irony that the name Israel literally in Hebrew means he struggles with God. Because their whole identity has wrapped up in this cycle of we're getting close to real change, we're dropping back. Here you go. We're going to skip all the way to the New Testament to the Apostle Paul because he knows this struggle and knows the answer and the secret to it. We're going to read a large section of this. It's from Romans chapter 7, and it's going to be on the screen here. Paul says, I don't understand myself at all. For I really want to do what's right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do the very thing I hate. I know perfectly well that what I'm doing is wrong, and my bad conscience shows that I agree that the law is good. But I can't help myself, because it is sin inside me that makes me do these evil things. I know I'm rotten through and through so far as my old sinful nature is concerned. No matter which way I turn, I can't make myself do right. I want to, but I can't. When I want to do good, I don't. When I try not to do wrong, I do it anyway. But if I'm doing what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing it. It's the sin within me. It's doing it. It seems to be a fact of life that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong. I love God's law with all my heart, but there's another law at work within me that is at war with my mind. This law wins the fight and makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin? Flip the page over and you'll see I quoted this from the New International Version as well. He says, what a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? The Apostle Paul had dug deeply into his soul to expose the pain and frustration and anguish over repeated attempts to be perfect and